So, Ned, Iran says it won't negotiate until Israel stops bombing. If Netanyahu wants to keep fighting and Trump decides he wants diplomacy, how does that play out? Because if Donald Trump says there's 2 weeks before he'll make a decision about finishing the job, but Israel decides, well, we're not going to stop, where does that leave the whole situation?
Well, Chris, I think when we look at this 2-week period, and we have to remember that President Trump said he would decide within 2 weeks, I think there are two potential explanations. One is the explanation that the White House offered. And if we want to take that at face value, it's the optimistic explanation. And I should caveat that optimism and hope should be a rare commodity in this administration. But I want to believe that President Trump is serious, that he wants to give diplomacy a chance. And there are really, to your question, two paths for that diplomacy. Number one is a continuation of the path that Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy, has engaged on in recent months, talking in some cases directly with senior Iranian officials, to include the Iranian foreign minister. And reporting indicates that even as Israeli munitions and bombs have been falling on Iran, Steve Witkoff has continued to engage in these discussions. The second diplomatic path is the one you also referenced, and that's the so-called E3, our European counterparts who were also signatories to the Iran deal, meeting in Geneva today. And I'm sure there are lots of people in the Trump orbit who are sort of rolling their eyes at the Europeans. Oh, there goes their happy talk again. But in this case, the Europeans do have real leverage, because it's these three European countries that can command essentially UN sanctions to be snapped back onto Iran. They have this tremendous economic leverage that I hope they're using to their advantage. So between the American pathway and the European pathway, my hope is that we can avert American involvement in a war that should not be ours. My concern, the second path, very briefly, Chris, is that this is just 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks to get more forces in theater, to take more defensive measures, to be more creative in how to get engaged in this campaign. Right now, sitting here today on Friday, I think either one is equally likely, but it sure seems like we'll find out in the coming days what President Trump will decide.
Yeah, and Courtney, speaking of people who are in the Trump orbit, you have new reporting on who exactly the president is listening to right now. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so while President Trump continues to do what he did in his first term here, which is to sort of crowdsource when there's a decision to be made, asking people, allies, both inside and outside the White House for their opinion on things. In the case of Iran, while he's still doing that to some extent, he's increasingly relying on a smaller and smaller group of advisors. Now, that includes Vice President J.D. Vance, his Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, of course, is also serving as the interim national security advisor, and, of course, the Deputy Chief of Staff to the White House, Stephen Miller. Those are sort of his core group of people who he's turning to as he tries to decide whether, in fact, to greenlight U.S. military action in Iran. Now, notably, two people who, according to a number of defense and senior administration officials we've spoken with, say are sidelined in this process are the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. She, of course, has pretty vocally, openly opposed U.S. military action in Iran and spoken out very vocally about her concerns about the possibility of any kind of a nuclear conflict. And then the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, another person who has been sidelined. And what's fascinating about it, Chris, is the officials we spoke with said that, in fact, the president is listening more to the uniformed members of the Department of Defense. That includes his relatively new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, and then the commander of U.S. Central Command, General Eric Kurilla. Kurilla's been at the helm of CENTCOM for going on 3.5 years throughout a lot of tough times, including October 7th. We're told that their advice and their counsel on the situation and what the United States should consider doing and the possible second and third order effects of any military action, the president is taking that very seriously. This also comes as one of the main bodies or major bodies in past administrations that would be used for this kind of decision. The National Security Council has been gutted in recent weeks, leaving even fewer voices to potentially provide that sort of counsel to President Trump right now, Chris.
So, Ned, the National Security Council also sidelined by reports. The nation's top intel official, Tulsi Gabbard, leader of the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth. In a normal administration, in a typical, if there is such a thing, administration, how unusual is that, and what is lost if all those folks who are usually key to this kind of decision are sidelined?
Yeah, Chris, this dynamic for people like me gives us some degree of ambivalence, because we want to say President Trump shouldn't be listening in any case to unqualified people like Pete Hegseth or somewhat kooky people like Tulsi Gabbard to begin with. And that should, at least on the surface, give us some comfort that they're not there in the Situation Room for the most sensitive of discussions. But look, I spent 3 years at the National Security Council. On my last job at the State Department, I sat in on all of these meetings. And the thing to keep in mind is that people, as they sit around the table in the Situation Room, they are not there in an ideal situation to represent their personal views. They are there to represent the informed, considered judgment of the department and agency they represent. So when someone like Tulsi Gabbard is not at the table, or when Pete Hegseth is not at the table, the views of the 17 departments and agencies that comprise our intelligence community aren't there. They're not getting the deference that they're due. And the civilian leadership of the military is not there, literally at the table. And we have to remember that in this country, there is nothing more important than civilian leadership of our military. So yes, some might take solace in the fact that these people have been relatively sidelined, but the process works that way for a reason. It's a deliberative process that brings together the perspectives of these departments and agencies, not of these individuals. And when this process isn't working, the decision-making process can't function properly.
So, Monica, a Republican senator who spoke on the condition of anonymity, told us he thinks Trump is going to delay this decision as long as he can. What do we know about his thinking?
Well, we know that this 2 weeks extension is really a very familiar refrain for the president when it comes to any kind of major policy decision, and even some that are pretty inconsequential. This is something he often likes to do when he wants to buy a little bit more runway. And then we all know and remember that sometimes we get to the end of 2 weeks and it's not a hard and fast deadline. It can shift again. It can be another couple of weeks. It can move, or it can never really come as he is predicting here. So this is an area where, of course, the White House is trying to buy a little bit of time for those diplomatic options that you've been talking about. And they do put a lot of stock in that right now. They feel that while those talks were pretty much stalled when the fire between Israel and Iran going back and forth began about a week ago, they think and are a little bit more optimistic looking at it today. And this is a president who likes to consider himself the ultimate deal maker. He still believes that somehow through negotiating behind the scenes that he can get Iran to accept some of the terms for some kind of an agreement that obviously they have been consistently rejecting and saying they will never agree to. But he still is holding out hope for that. But there are a lot of different voices. And exactly as Courtney has talked about with her reporting, he is having lunch with people all the time who could be giving him a differing perspective, like Steve Bannon, who was at the White House and that he sat down with yesterday. And he also, we know, is certainly mulling this idea of involving the U.S. in a longer-term war as one that he is very nervous to do. He has spoken about that many times, and he has, in conversations with advisors, worried about that idea that could this be something that is targeted if the U.S. military is more involved and done in a shorter term, if this is something that's going to drag the U.S. into a forever war for years or decades, as the fear would be. That is something at this point it seems the president is a little more reluctant to do. And we know he's getting all kinds of input from all kinds of allies on every single part of this decision.